long before the great temples of Egypt rose from the desert sands, long before the philosophers of Athens debated the nature of the soul. There existed a civilization in the Fertile Crescent between two rivers that understood something profound about the invisible world. The people of ancient Mesopotamia, dwelling in the land we now call Iraq, built the first cities humanity had ever known. And with those cities came the first systematic attempts to protect human beings from forces that lurked beyond the veil of ordinary perception. These were not primitive people stumbling in darkness. They were sophisticated thinkers who developed writing, mathematics, and astronomy, and they applied that same intellectual rigor to the problem of malevolent spirits. The Sumerians, who flourished in southern Mesopotamia from roughly 4500 BCE onward, believed that the world teemed with supernatural entities. Some were benevolent, allied with the great gods who maintained cosmic order. Others were hostile, chaotic beings that delighted in tormenting humanity. These demons did not exist in some distant hell awaiting the afterlife. They walked the earth in the present moment, causing disease, madness, misfortune, and death. Every illness had a spiritual dimension. Every streak of bad luck suggested the presence of something unseen and hungry. To live in ancient Sumer was to live in constant awareness that the boundary between the human world and the spirit world was terrifyingly thin. The response to this existential threat was the development of an entire class of ritual specialists. The Apu, often translated as exorcist or incantation priest, devoted his life to mastering the arts of spiritual protection and banishment. This was not a marginal profession practiced by village-wise women at the edges of society. Apu held an honored position, often serving in royal courts and major temples. His training was extensive, requiring years of study in the scribal schools where he would memorize vast collections of incantations, learn the properties of sacred substances, and master the complex rituals that could drive away even the most powerful demons. The knowledge was considered divine in origin, passed down from the gods themselves to protect humanity from the chaos that constantly threatened to overwhelm civilization. The tools of the Aipu were many, but words held primary importance. The Mesopotamians believed that language itself possessed inherent power. A correctly spoken incantation was not merely a request to the gods for help. It was a force in its own right, capable of binding spirits, compelling obedience, and reshaping reality. The priest would recite his spells in Sumerian, even long after that language had ceased to be spoken in daily life, because the ancient tongue carried greater magical authority. These were not improvised prayers. They were precisely worded formulas passed down through generations with painstaking accuracy, because even a small error might render the ritual ineffective, or, worse, anger the very forces one sought to control. Among the most important collections of banishing rituals was the series known as Maqlû, a word meaning burning. This extensive text, compiled during the first millennium BCE, but drawing on much older traditions, contained dozens of incantations and ritual instructions designed to combat witchcraft. The ancient Mesopotamians greatly feared human sorcerers who might use dark magic to curse their enemies. A person suffering from illness or misfortune might conclude that a witch had targeted them, and the Maqlû rituals offered a means of fighting back. The ceremonies were elaborate affairs conducted over the course of a night, involving the creation of small figurines representing the witch, which would then be burned while the priest recited spells calling upon the gods of fire to consume the evil directed at the victim. Fire held tremendous significance in these rites. It was understood as a purifying force, capable of destroying spiritual contamination, just as it could destroy physical matter. The god Jira, Lord of Fire, was frequently invoked in banishing rituals. Braziers filled with burning substances would be placed around the ritual space, their smoke carrying prayers upward to the heavens, while simultaneously driving away malevolent spirits who could not endure the sacred flames. Torches might be waved around a sick person or passed over their body to cleanse them of demonic influence. The dancing light pushed back the darkness where demons lurked, creating a zone of safety in a world full of invisible dangers. Water served as another essential element in Mesopotamian banishing practices. Holy water, consecrated through ritual and prayer, could wash away spiritual impurity just as ordinary water cleaned the body. Sprinkling or pouring sacred water over a patient, a building, or an object was believed to drive out attached spirits. Rivers, particularly the great Tigris and Euphrates that gave life to the entire civilization, was seen as sources of purifying power. Some rituals required that figurines representing demons be cast into flowing water, symbolically washing the evil away from the community and back into the primordial chaos from which it came. Salt appeared constantly in these ancient rites. Its preservative properties made it a natural symbol of protection and permanence. Scattering salt around a dwelling or a ritual space created a barrier that hostile spirits could not easily cross. The mineral was associated with the gods of the netherworld and carried the authority of those chthonic powers. When combined with other sacred substances and properly consecrated through incantation, salt became a weapon against the forces of darkness. This use of salt for spiritual protection would echo through countless cultures and millennia, eventually appearing in traditions as diverse as Japanese Shinto and European folk magic, testament to how fundamental and effective the Mesopotamians found this simple substance. The demons themselves were not abstract concepts, but vividly imagined beings with distinct personalities, appearances, and methods of attack. Pazuzu, perhaps the most famous of Mesopotamian demons in modern times, thanks to his appearance in popular horror films, was a wind demon with the head of a dog or lion, the wings of an eagle, the claws of a lion, and the tail of a scorpion. Yet here we encounter a fascinating complexity in Mesopotamian demonology. Pazuzu, despite his terrifying appearance, was frequently invoked as a protector. Camelids, bearing his image, hung in homes and around the necks of pregnant women, because Pazuzu was known as an enemy of Lamashtu, an even more fearsome demoness who preyed upon mothers and infants. The logic was simple and pragmatic. One demon might be set against another, and a frightening guardian was better than no guardian at all. Lamashtu herself represented one of the most dreaded threats in the Mesopotamian supernatural landscape. Unlike many demons who served the gods and could be commanded by them, Lamashtu was a divine being in her own right, daughter of the sky god Inu. She acted according to her own malevolent will, stalking pregnant women, causing miscarriages, stealing infants from their cradles, and spreading disease wherever she went. Her leonine head, donkey ears, and bird talons made her immediately recognizable in art. Protecting against Lamashtu required powerful magic, including the display of Pazuzu amulets and the recitation of specific incantations that called upon the great gods to restrain her. Plaques depicting her image might seem counterintuitive as protective devices, but they functioned as a form of spiritual contract, showing the demoness receiving offerings and gifts that would satisfy her hunger and convince her to depart. The Zerpu series represented another major collection of purification and banishing rituals, where Maqlû focused specifically on witchcraft. Zerpu addressed a broader problem of ritual impurity in the sense that might bring divine punishment and demonic attack. The ancient Mesopotamians believed that violating taboos, breaking oaths, or offending the gods could open a person to spiritual assault. The demons were, in some sense, agents of cosmic justice, punishing those who had disrupted the proper order of things. The Zerpu rituals aimed to identify the source of contamination, confess and expiate the offense, and purify the sufferer so that the demons would have no further claim upon them. These purification rites could be extraordinarily detailed. The priests might recite long lists of possible sins, covering nearly every conceivable transgression, while the patient burned symbolic objects representing their offenses. Knots would be tied in string to represent the bonds of guilt, then untied and burned to symbolize release. Peeling an onion layer by layer while reciting incantations allowed the patient to shed their sins as the layers fell away. Passing between torches cleansed the body. Breaking a reed near the patient demonstrated the breaking of the demonic hold. Every action carried meaning. Every gesture reinforced the transformation taking place. The physical space in which these rituals occurred mattered tremendously, creating a sacred precinct separated from the ordinary world and protected from spiritual intrusion was essential to safe practice. The Iaipu would mark out boundaries using flour or some other substance, establishing a zone where hostile forces could not enter and where the priest could work without interference. This concept of the protected ritual circle, so fundamental to later Western ceremonial magic, finds some of its earliest expressions in these Mesopotamian practices. Within the circle, the practitioner stood between worlds, safe from the chaos outside, while wielding the authority of the gods themselves. The relationship between the Iaipu and the divine realm was crucial. The priest did not banish demons through his own personal power. He acted as an agent of the gods, channeling their authority through proper ritual form. Incantations frequently invoked Marduk, the great god of Babylon, or Ea, the wise lord of sweet waters and magic, or Shamash, the sun god who could illuminate every hidden thing. The priest might identify himself with these deities, speaking in their voices to command the demons. This was not arrogance, but proper ritual form. By becoming a vessel for divine power, the Iaipu could wield forces far beyond mere human capability. The temples themselves served as centers of spiritual protection for entire communities. Kuat, the great ziggurats that dominated Mesopotamian cities, were not merely impressive architecture, They were cosmic mountains, connecting earth and heaven, radiating divine blessing across the surrounding land. Within the temple complex, skilled priests maintained daily rituals that kept the gods present and pleased, ensuring their protection against the forces of chaos. When great threats arose, such as eclipses or epidemics, special ceremonies mobilized the full spiritual resources of the city. Drums would beat, incantations would ring out, and the combined will of priests and people would drive back the darkness. The legacy of Mesopotamian banishing practices extends far beyond the fall of Babylon. When Persian, Greek, and eventually Roman conquerors swept through the ancient Near East, they encountered these sophisticated magical traditions and absorbed many of their elements. The image of the exorcist priest, armed with sacred words and holy substances, commanding spirits in the name of higher powers, became a template that would be adapted by every subsequent Western tradition. The specific demons faded from memory, but the fundamental understanding that words have power, that fire and water and salt can purify, that circles can protect, and that properly performed ritual can command the invisible world. These insights survived. They traveled along trade routes and through conquered territories, seeding the soil from which later magical traditions would grow. Every time a modern practitioner lights a candle, draws a circle, or speaks words of power, they echo rituals first performed in the mud brick temples of Sumer 5,000 years ago. The Nile River cut through a landscape of burning sand like a ribbon of life threading through death itself. Along its banks, a civilization arose that would endure for 3,000 years, building monuments that still stand and developing magical practices that would influence every tradition that followed. The ancient Egyptians did not merely believe in magic, they understood it as a fundamental force woven into the fabric of creation itself, as real and essential as the sun that crossed the sky each day or the floods that renewed the land each year. Their approach to banishing hostile forces reflected this deep integration of the magical and the mundane, producing protective practices of extraordinary sophistication and enduring power. The Egyptian word for magic was Heka, and it was far more than a human technique. Heka was a primordial god, one of the first beings to emerge at the dawn of creation, a deity who stood beside the sun god Ra in a celestial boat as it traveled through the underworld each night. This divine magic existed before the other gods and would persist after all things ended. When humans practiced Heka, they were not manipulating some neutral energy. They were participating in a cosmic force that the gods themselves employed. Understanding elevated Egyptian magic far above mere superstition. It was a technology of the sacred, a means by which mortals could access the same powers that maintained the universe. The practitioners of this magic held various titles and served various functions. The Haku, or magician, might work independently or serve in the great temples. The Sao, specialists in protective magic, focused specifically on creating amulets and performing rites that shielded individuals from harm. The priests of Circuit, the scorpion goddess, dealt with venomous creatures and the demons associated with them. Temple physicians combined medical knowledge with magical practice, understanding that physical and spiritual ailments were often intertwined. Together, these specialists formed a network of protection that extended from the palace of the pharaoh to the humblest village along the river. Words held supreme power in Egyptian magic, perhaps even more so than in Mesopotamia. The Egyptians believed that naming something gave power over it, and that correctly spoken words could compel reality to conform to the speaker's will. The god Thoth, ibis-headed lord of wisdom and writing, had created the world through speech. When a magician recited an incantation, he was echoing that primordial creative act. The hieroglyphic script itself was called Medu Neter. The words of the gods, in the written form of a spell, carried power even when not spoken aloud. Amulets, inscribed with protective formulas, worked continuously, their carved words forever repeating their magical commands. The concept of the divine name lay at the heart of Egyptian protective magic. Every god possessed a true name, a secret identity that contained the essence of their being. To know a god's true name was to have power over that deity. The most famous expression of this belief appears in the myth where Isis tricks Ra into revealing his hidden name, gaining power over the sun god himself. When magicians invoked divine names in their banishing rituals, they were wielding this same principle. Demons could be commanded in the names of gods, whose authority they could not resist. The names themselves were weapons, and the most powerful incantations strung together long sequences of divine appellations, overwhelming hostile spirits with an avalanche of sacred authority. The Book of the Dead, that famous collection of funerary texts, was essentially a manual of protective magic for the afterlife journey. The deceased would need to pass through gates guarded by terrifying beings, navigate lakes of fire, and avoid the snares of demons who wished to destroy the soul before it reached the paradise of the field of reeds. The spells inscribed on tomb walls and papyrus scrolls gave the dead the knowledge they needed to overcome these obstacles. Knowing the names of the gate guardians allowed passage, citing the correct formulas transformed dangers into opportunities. The entire elaborate Egyptian funeral industry was fundamentally an exercise in magical protection, ensuring that the soul would survive the perilous journey through the underworld. Yet, protective magic was not reserved for the dead alone. The living faced constant threats from spirits, demons, and the malevolent dead. The boundary between worlds was permeable, and dangerous beings could cross into the realm of the living to cause harm. Night was especially perilous, as darkness freed the forces of chaos. Every sunset reenacted the cosmic drama of Ra descending into the underworld to battle the serpent Apophis. And the earthly darkness released smaller echoes of that primordial enemy. Egyptian homes contained amulets, protective images, and inscribed formulas that created barriers against these nocturnal threats. Certain deities specialized in protection and became focal points for banishing practices. Base, the dwarf god, with his leonine face and protruding tongue, appeared throughout Egyptian homes, particularly in bedrooms and areas associated with childbirth. His grotesque appearance was deliberately frightening, designed to scare away malevolent spirits. Women in labor would have images of Base nearby, and magical wands inscribed with this figure would be passed over mother and infant to drive away the demons that threaten the vulnerable moments of birth. Unlike the austere and dignified images of most Egyptian gods, Base was fierce and direct. A divine bouncer whose job was to keep dangerous entities away from the innocent. Torchlit, the hippopotamus goddess, served similar protective functions. Her massive form, combining hippopotamus, crocodile, and lion elements, struck terror into demons while offering safety to pregnant women and children. Amulets of Torchlit were among the most common protective objects in ancient Egypt. The logic underlying these figures was consistent with broader Egyptian magical thinking. The terrifying appearance that would frighten humans also frightened spirits. By surrounding oneself with images of fierce protective deities, one created a spiritual fortress that demons dared not approach. Sekhmet, the lioness goddess, presented a more complex case. She was simultaneously one of the most dangerous and most protective deities in the Egyptian pantheon. Her rage could bring plague and destruction upon humanity, yet that same destructive power could be directed against enemies and evil spirits. Priests of Sekhmet specialized in both healing the sick and performing exorcisms, understanding that the goddess who sent disease could also withdraw it. Repeating Sekhmet through proper worship kept her favorable and enlisted her fearsome strength against demonic forces. The statues of Sekhmet that lined Egyptian temples were not merely decorative. They were magical guardians, their stone eyes watching for threats invisible to human perception. Execration rituals represented a particularly powerful form of Egyptian banishing magic. These ceremonies targeted specific enemies, whether human, spiritual, or conceptual, and sought to destroy their power utterly. The most common form involved inscribing the names of enemies on clay pots, figurines, or tablets, then ritually destroying these objects through smashing, burning, or burial. Destruction of the name was understood as destruction of the named being's power. Vast deposits of broken execration figures have been discovered by archaeologists, testifying to the widespread use of these practices. The names inscribed include not only foreign rulers and rebellious vassals, but also diseases, demons, and abstract concepts like chaos and evil itself. The ritual destruction was accompanied by specific incantations that directed and amplified the magical action. The officiant would speak words of power that declared the enemy bound, silenced, and destroyed. The past tense was often used deliberately, as if the destruction had already occurred, because speaking something as accomplished helped make it real. This performative aspect of Egyptian magic, where ritual action and spoken word combined to reshape reality, would become a template for ceremonial practices throughout the ancient world and beyond. Amulets formed the most common and accessible form of protective magic in ancient Egypt. Worn on the body, placed in homes, or wrapped with the dead, these small objects carried concentrated magical power. The Eye of Horus, or Wedget, was perhaps the most ubiquitous, representing the healed eye of the god Horus after his battle with Set. Its image conveyed wholeness, healing, and protection. The scarab beetle, associated with the sun god's daily rebirth, offered renewal and transformation. The Ankh, symbol of life itself, bestowed vital force upon its wearer. The Djed pillar, representing the backbone of Osiris, provided stability and strength. Each symbol carried specific protective properties, and Egyptians often wore multiple amulets simultaneously, combining their powers for comprehensive spiritual defense. The manufacture of amulets was itself a magical process. Simply carving the correct shape was not sufficient. The object had to be ritually activated through spoken spells that invited the appropriate divine force to inhabit the physical form. The priest would recite incantations that identified the amulet with the deity or power it represented, transforming inert material into a living magical tool. This activation might occur in temple workshops where skilled craftsmen created amulets on an almost industrial scale. meeting the enormous popular demand for protective objects. Protective magic extended beyond personal items to architectural features. Temples incorporated defensive magical elements in their very construction. Doorways, those liminal spaces where outside and inside met, received particular attention. Images of protective deities flanked entrances. Quaint, magical texts inscribed on lintels prevented hostile spirits from crossing the threshold. The outer walls of temples might be decorated with scenes of the pharaoh smiting enemies. A magical act that rendered the temple's surroundings safe. Even the orientation of buildings relative to the sun and stars carried magical significance, lining sacred spaces with cosmic forces that enhanced their protective power. The magician's toolkit included various substances believed to carry inherent magical properties. Natron, the naturally occurring salt compound used in mummification, possessed powerful purifying qualities. Water that had been poured over statues inscribed with magical texts, called statue water, was drunk by patients to ingest the healing power of the inscriptions. Incense, particularly frankincense and myrrh, created smoke that carried prayers to heaven while simultaneously driving away malevolent spirits who could not endure its sacred fragrance. Wax, easily shaped and destroyed, was favored for creating execration figures. Each substance had its place in the magician's pharmacopoeia, its properties known through generations of practical application. The integration of protective magic into daily life created a worldview where the spiritual and material were never truly separate. An Egyptian arising in the morning might speak words of protection, wore amulets on their person, passed through doorways marked with magical signs, work under the watchful eyes of divine images, return home to a bedroom guarded by the fierce face of Base. This was not paranoia, but prudent engagement with the cosmos understood to contain real dangers. The elaborate magical infrastructure was as practical in its way as locks on doors or walls around cities. It addressed threats that were just as real to Egyptian understanding as any human enemy. The influence of Egyptian magical practices spread throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. Egypt fell under Persian, Greek, and finally Roman rule. Its magical traditions did not disappear, but merged with other systems. The famous Greek magical papyri, discovered in Egypt and dating from the 2nd century BCE through the 5th century CE, blend Egyptian divine names and practices with Greek and Jewish elements. The goddess Isis, great of magic, became a universal deity worshipped throughout the Roman Empire, carrying Egyptian magical concepts wherever her cult spread. The enduring Western fascination with Egyptian magic, from Renaissance Hermeticism through modern occultism, testifies to the profound and lasting impact of these ancient Nile Valley traditions on humanity's understanding of how to command the invisible powers that shape our fate. The wine-dark seas that surrounded the Greek world carried more than merchants and soldiers between scattered islands and coastal cities. It carried ideas, beliefs, and magical practices that would blend with indigenous traditions to create something new and powerful. The Greeks inherited much from the older civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt, but they transformed what they received, filtering it through their unique philosophical temperament and adding innovations that would shape Western magical practice for millennia to come. Their approach to banishing hostile forces combined practical ritual with theoretical sophistication, creating a framework that later ages would elaborate upon but never entirely surpass. The Greek language itself gave us the word from which we derive apotropaic, meaning that which turns away evil. Apotropeus was an epithet applied to gods and their protective aspect, most notably Apollo and Zeus, who could be invoked to avert harm from individuals and communities. This linguistic marker points to how central the concept of turning away malevolent forces was to Greek religious consciousness. Protection was not a marginal concern addressed by village-wise women at the edges of respectable society. It was embedded in mainstream religion, acknowledged by philosophers, and practiced at every level of society, from humble farmers to the greatest city-states. The household formed the primary unit of Greek protective practice. Every home contained a hearth sacred to Hestia, goddess of the domestic fire, whose flame represented the continuity and safety of the family. Offerings at the hearth maintained the goodwill of this gentle deity and kept the center of the home spiritually pure. The doorway, that vulnerable transition between the protected interior and the dangerous exterior, received particular attention. Stone pillars, topped with the head of Hermes and featuring carved phalluses, stood at entrances to ward off evil spirits. The phallic element was not obscene, but apotropaic, its vital energy repelling hostile forces. Similarly, images of gorgons, with their petrifying gaze and protruding tongues, were mounted above doors to frighten away malevolent entities before they could cross the threshold. The concept of miasma, or pollution, deeply influenced Greek protective practices. Asthma was a kind of spiritual contamination that could arise from contact with death, bloodshed, or transgression against divine law. It was understood as almost physically contagious, capable of spreading from person to person and afflicting entire communities. Those suffering from miasma attracted misfortune and divine punishment, not through any moral failing of their own, but through the mechanical operation of cosmic forces. Purification rituals were therefore essential. And Greek religion developed elaborate ceremonies to cleanse individuals and spaces of accumulated spiritual pollution. Water played a central role in Greek purification, just as it had in older Near Eastern traditions. Lustral basins stood at the entrances to temples, allowing worshippers to wash their hands before entering sacred space. Seawater was considered especially potent for purification, its salt content giving it power to cleanse spiritual as well as physical dirt. Those guilty of bloodshed might be required to bathe in running water, allowing the contamination to flow away from them. The nymph-haunted springs that dotted the Greek landscape were sacred sites where purification could occur. Their waters, blessed by divine presence. Fire served equally important purificatory functions. The burning of sulfur, called theon in Greek, a word etymologically connected to the divine, was a common fumigation practice. The acrid smoke drove out evil spirits while simultaneously cleansing spaces of miasma. Torches, carried in procession, created moving zones of purity. The great festivals of the Greek cities often began with ritual purifications that included both water, lustrations, and fire fumigations, preparing the community to enter into sacred time and space. The combination of these two elements, one liquid and one gaseous, one cooling and one heating, addressed contamination on multiple levels simultaneously. Certain plants possessed inherent apotropaic properties in Greek understanding. Laurel, sacred to Apollo, could be hung above doorways or burned to purify spaces. Squill, a type of sea onion, was used in purification ceremonies and planted at boundaries to protect property. Garlic, with its pungent odor, repelled both evil spirits and the evil eye. The Greeks believed that strong smells, whether pleasant like incense or unpleasant like garlic, confused and drove away malevolent beings who could not endure sensory intensity. This pharmacological approach to spiritual protection drew on deep observation of how different substances affected the invisible world. The evil eye represented a constant threat in Greek consciousness, a belief that envious or malevolent gazes could cause harm to the persons or property upon which they fell. Protection against the evil eye was ubiquitous. Amulets featuring eyes, designed to reflect the harmful gaze back upon its sender, were worn by men, women, and children. Grotesque images, including the phalluses on Hermes, were thought to distract the evil eye through their startling appearance. Spitting 3 times upon seeing something that might attract envy was a folk practice that survived into modern Greek culture. Cute. The evil eye was democratic in its threat, affecting rich and poor alike, and required constant vigilance to avoid. The Diphyxiones, or cursed tablets, revealed a darker side of Greek magical practice that nonetheless illuminates beliefs about commanding spiritual forces. These thin sheets of lead, inscribed with curses and typically deposited in graves or sanctuaries of chthonic deities, sought to bind enemies and bring them harm. While curses are the opposite of protection in their intent, the same magical technology could be applied defensively. Counter curses sought to nullify magical attacks. Binding spells could restrain not only human enemies, but also the demons that might plague an individual. The techniques of compelling spiritual forces to do one's bidding applied equally to offensive and defensive magic. Chthonic deities, those gods and spirits associated with the underworld and the earth, played crucial roles in Greek magical practice. Heka, goddess of crossroads and witchcraft, was a liminal deity who stood between worlds and could be invoked, both to sense spirits and to command them to depart. Offerings to Heka were left at crossroads on the night of the new moon, propitiating her and her ghostly retinue. Persephone, queen of the underworld, held authority over the dead and the demons that dwelt in her shadowy realm. Hermes, in his aspect as psychopomp, god of souls, conducted the dead to the underworld and possessed knowledge of paths between worlds that made him invaluable for magical operations. Greek philosophers engaged seriously with questions about the nature of spiritual beings and the possibility of commanding them. Plato's writings distinguished between gods, daemons, and heroes, establishing a hierarchy of spiritual beings that would influence all subsequent Western thought. Daemons in Platonic thought were intermediate beings between gods and humans, responsible for carrying prayers upward and divine influence downward. They were not inherently evil, though some could be harmful, and their nature was a subject of philosophical debate. This intellectual framework gave Greek magical practice a theoretical foundation that earlier traditions had lacked, allowing practitioners to understand their work as operating according to cosmic principles rather than merely following received tradition. The Greek magical papyri, some remarkable collection of texts preserved in the dry Egyptian climate, reveals the sophisticated synthesis that emerged when Greek thought combined with Egyptian and Near Eastern magical traditions. Dating from the 2nd century BCE through the 5th century CE, these documents contain spells, rituals, and instructions that draw on multiple cultural sources. Greek gods appear alongside Egyptian deities. Jewish divine names echo through incantations, otherwise thoroughly pagan. The syncretic nature of these texts reflects the cosmopolitan reality of the Hellenistic world, where cultural boundaries had become permeable and magical practitioners freely borrowed whatever worked. Roman religion absorbed Greek influence while maintaining distinctive Italian elements. The Romans were famously practical in their approach to religion, treating relationships with the gods as matters of contract and obligation rather than emotional devotion. This transactional quality extended to their protective practices. Proper performance of ritual guaranteed results. The gods were bound by the same agreements that bound humans. Exactness in ritual formula was essential because the slightest error could void the spiritual contract, and leave the petitioner unprotected. Every Roman household maintained a shrine to the Lares, spirits of the ancestors and protectors of the family. Daily offerings of food and wine kept these spirits favorable and enlisted their aid in defending the home against hostile forces. The Lares were not the only household spirits. The Penates guarded the storeroom and ensured the family's prosperity. The genius of the paterfamilias, a kind of guardian spirit attached to the male head of household, received worship on his birthday and protected his person. This dense population of protective spirits surrounded Roman families with layers of spiritual defense. The Lemuria festival, held on the 9th, 11th, and 13th of May, addressed the threat of Lemures, restless spirits of the dead who returned to trouble the living. The rituals were performed by the head of the household at midnight. Rising barefoot from his bed, he would walk through the house, making a sign with his fingers to ward off any spirits he might encounter. He would wash his hands in pure spring water, then take black beans in his mouth, spit them out behind him, repeat 9 times the formula that he offered the beans to ransom himself and his family, The spirits, following behind, would gather the beans. Then the householder would wash again, clash bronze pots together to create noise that drove away the dead, and repeat 9 times the command for ancestral spirits to depart. Only then was the dangerous ritual complete. Fumigation played an important role in Roman purification, with sulfur being the most commonly used substance for driving out evil spirits and cleansing miasma. Laurel and other sacred plants might be burned for gentler purification. The smoke was understood as creating an atmosphere intolerable to hostile spirits, while simultaneously carrying prayers upward to the gods. Roman temples employed fumigation regularly, maintaining spaces free of the spiritual pollution that might interfere with proper worship. The integration of Greek and Roman magical practices created a shared Greco-Roman tradition that would form the foundation for later Western occultism. When Rome absorbed the Eastern Mediterranean into its empire, it brought Egyptian, Babylonian, Persian, and Jewish magical elements into this synthesis. The result was a remarkably sophisticated system of spiritual technology, documented in texts that would survive the fall of Rome and be rediscovered by medieval and Renaissance magicians. The practical Romans and philosophical Greeks together built an edifice of protective practice upon the foundations laid by ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, advancing the eternal human project of defending against the invisible forces that threatened well-being. Their innovations in ritual form, their theoretical frameworks, and their syncretic openness to foreign wisdom would echo through every subsequent development in the art of banishing. In the ancient land of Canaan, a people emerged whose understanding of the divine would reshape human history. The Israelites developed a religious vision centered on one God, a deity who had created the universe and continued to govern it through moral law. This monotheistic revolution did not eliminate belief in other spiritual beings, but reframed them within a new cosmic hierarchy. Angels served the one God as messengers and agents. Demons existed as tempters and tormentors, their power ultimately subordinate to divine will. Within this framework, the Jewish people developed distinctive approaches to banishing hostile forces, approaches that would profoundly influence Christianity, Islam, and Western esotericism. The Hebrew scriptures contain numerous references to spiritual threats and divine protection. The Psalms, those ancient songs of praise and lament, frequently invoke God as a shield and fortress against enemies, both physical and spiritual. Psalm 91, sometimes called the Psalm of Protection, promises that those who dwell in the shelter of the Most High will be delivered from the snare of the fowler and the deadly pestilence. Angels are dispatched to guard the faithful, bearing them up lest they dash their foot against a stone. This psalm would become one of the most frequently used texts in Jewish and later Christian protective magic. Its words inscribed on amulets and recited in rituals of defense against demonic assault. The Shema, that central declaration of Jewish faith, proclaiming the oneness of God, carried protective power beyond its theological content. The command to bind these words as a sign upon one's hand and as frontlets between one's eyes was understood literally, giving rise to the practice of wearing tefillin, small leather boxes containing scriptural passages. The mezuzah, affixed to doorposts, in obedience to the same scriptural command, transformed every Jewish home into a protected space. These were not merely reminders of religious obligation. They were magical objects in the fullest sense, physical vessels containing the sacred words that commanded reality. The divine name itself, too holy to pronounce, carried supreme power, and its proper invocation could accomplish what no other force could achieve. The figure of King Solomon loomed large in Jewish magical tradition. Renowned for his wisdom, Solomon was credited with power over demons that far exceeded ordinary human capability. According to legend, God had granted Solomon a magical ring inscribed with a divine name, giving him authority to command spirits and compel them to labor in building the great temple. The Testament of Solomon, a text composed sometime in the early centuries of the Common Era, elaborates this tradition in remarkable detail, presents Solomon interrogating demons, learning their names, their functions, and the angelic powers that could subdue them. Each demon reveals its weakness, providing Solomon and future magicians with the knowledge necessary to banish or bind these hostile entities. The demonology presented in the Testament of Solomon reflects the cosmopolitan environment of late antiquity, blending Jewish, Greek, and Near Eastern elements. Demons bear both Semitic and Greek names. They are associated with zodiacal signs and planetary influences, revealing the astrological concerns of the Hellenistic age. Yet the fundamental framework remains Jewish. The demons are subject to the authority of the God of Israel, and it is through divine names and angelic intermediaries that they are controlled. This text would become a foundational document for medieval grimoire magic. Its lists of demons and methods of command, copied and elaborated by generations of magical practitioners. Angelic beings occupied a crucial position in Jewish protective practice. While monotheism precluded worshiping angels, invoking their assistance was entirely proper. Michael, whose name means who is like God, served as the great defender of Israel and the principal opponent of Satan. Gabriel, strength of God, appeared as a messenger of divine will and a protector of the righteous. Raphael, healing of God, brought both physical and spiritual restoration. Uriel, light of God, illuminated hidden things and guarded against deception. These four archangels, associated with the four cardinal directions, would become central figures in later ceremonial magic. Their names invoked to establish protected space and command lesser spirits. The development of Jewish mysticism, particularly the traditions that would eventually be called Kabbalah, brought new depth and sophistication to protective magical practice. Early Jewish mysticism focused on the ascent of the soul through heavenly realms, a dangerous journey that required passing guardians at each level. The Merkava tradition, named for the divine chariot or throne described in the visions of Ezekiel, taught techniques for rising through the celestial palaces to encounter the divine presence. This was not mere contemplation, but actual travel, and the dangers were real. Hostile angels guarded the gates, ready to destroy those who approached without proper preparation. Passwords, seals, and divine names were essential equipment for the mystical voyager. The Heka literature, texts describing these heavenly journeys, contains extensive material on the names and powers that enabled safe passage through dangerous spiritual territories. The mystic would memorize complex sequences of divine names, angelic appellations, and magical formulas. At each gate, the guardian would demand identification, and only the correct response would grant passage. Failure meant destruction. These texts reveal how seriously the ancient Jewish mystics took the reality of spiritual beings and the necessity of proper protection when engaging with the invisible world. The technology of divine names was not metaphorical, but operational, producing real effects in the spiritual realm. Cana, the divine names themselves, constituted the supreme magical tools in Jewish tradition. The four-letter name of God, the Tetragrammaton, was so sacred that its pronunciation was forbidden. Yet, its written form appeared in countless protective contexts. Other divine names, some derived from scripture and others from mystical traditions, carried specific powers and applications. The 72-fold name, constructed through complex manipulations of biblical verses, was particularly potent. The Shem Hamfarash, as this name came to be called, is contained within it the names of 72 angels whose assistance could be invoked for various purposes. Medieval and Renaissance magicians would elaborate extensively on these angelic correspondences. The emergence of practical Kabbalah provided systematic frameworks for protective and banishing practices, while the contemplative Kabbalah focused on mystical understanding of divine reality. Practical Kabbalah addressed the application of mystical principles to affect the material world. This included the creation of amulets, the performance of rituals, and the invocation of angelic powers for specific purposes. The Tree of Life, that central diagram of Kabbalistic thought, mapped the emanations through which divine energy descended into creation. Understanding these pathways allowed the practitioner to draw down appropriate forces and to banish inappropriate ones. The concept of kalapat, or shells, became important in later Kabbalistic demonology. These were understood as husks of impurity that surrounded and obscured the holy sparks of divine light scattered throughout creation. Demonic beings were associated with these kalapat, drawing their existence from the waste products of the creative process. The task of the righteous was to separate the holy from the impure, releasing the trapped sparks and diminishing the power of the demonic realm. This cosmological framework gave banishing practices a significance beyond mere personal protection. Every exorcism, every purification, contributed to the great work of cosmic repair called tikkun. Jewish folk magic developed alongside these more learned traditions, addressing the practical needs of ordinary people facing spiritual threats. The evil I was greatly feared, and numerous practices emerged to protect against it. Red strings tied around wrists, particularly for infants, created protective barriers. Spitting 3 times when danger threatened dispersed negative energy. Iron objects repelled demonic beings who could not endure contact with that metal. Salt, as in so many other cultures, created barriers against hostile spirits. These folk practices coexisted with more elaborate rabbinic magic, addressing the same threats through simpler means accessible to those without specialized training. The tradition of the Baal Shem, the master of the divine name, represented a distinctive Jewish approach to magical practice. These wonder workers specialized in the manipulation of sacred names for healing, protection, and exorcism. They operated at the boundary between learned mysticism and folk magic, bringing Kabbalistic techniques to bear on practical problems. The most famous of these figures, Israel ben Eliezer, known as the Baal Shem Tov, founded the Hasidic movement in the 18th century, while Hasidism would develop in directions that moved beyond magical practice. Its origins in the Baal Shem tradition reveal how central, protective, and healing magic was to Jewish religious life. Exorcism in the Jewish tradition developed distinctive forms. The Dibuk, a spirit of a dead person that possessed a living, became a significant concern in later medieval and early modern Jewish communities. These possessing spirits were understood as souls that had been denied entry to the afterlife due to unfinished business or great sin. They attached themselves to living persons, speaking through them and tormenting them. Elaborate exorcism rituals evolved to drive out Dibukum, involving the recitation of psalms, the invocation of divine names, the commanding of the spirit to depart to its proper place. The exorcists acted with the authority of heaven, compelling obedience from the restless dead. The influence of Jewish magical traditions on later Western occultism cannot be overstated. The divine names that powered medieval and Renaissance ceremonial magic were overwhelmingly Hebrew. The angelic hierarchies invoked in elaborate rituals derive from Jewish sources. The Kabbalah itself became central to Christian esotericism, adapted and transformed, but never losing its essential Jewish character. When later magicians drew circles, spoke words of power, and commanded spirits in the names of celestial beings, they employed techniques developed over centuries by Jewish mystics and wonder workers. The contribution of Jewish tradition to the technology of banishing represents one of the most significant chapters, the entire history of protective magic, providing tools and frameworks that remain in use today. The carpenter from Nazareth, who had changed the world, demonstrated remarkable power over unclean spirits. The Gospels record numerous encounters in which Jesus of Nazareth confronted demonic beings and drove them out with authoritative command. Unlike the elaborate rituals of contemporary Jewish exorcists who employed incantations, divine names, and magical implements, Jesus operated through direct personal authority, spoke, and demons obeyed. This simple yet stunning display of power over the invisible realm became foundational to Christian identity and established exorcism as a central practice of the new faith. The ability to cast out demons served as evidence of divine commission, a sign that the kingdom of God had drawn near. The Gospel accounts present demon possession as a common affliction requiring spiritual intervention. In the synagogue at Capernaum, a man possessed by an unclean spirit cried out in recognition of Jesus as the Holy One of God. Jesus rebuked the spirit with a command to be silent and come out, and with convulsions the demon departed. The Gerasene demoniac, possessed by a legion of spirits, lived among the tombs in a state of constant torment until Jesus commanded the demons into a herd of swine. Mary Magdalene, later one of the most devoted followers, had been delivered from 7 demons. These narratives established the pattern that would define Christian exorcism for 2 millennia, presenting the confrontation between divine authority and demonic power as a fundamental aspect of spiritual reality. The early church understood exorcism as a gift bestowed upon believers generally, rather than a specialized function reserved for clergy alone. The book of Acts records the apostles casting out spirits, and Paul's letters indicate that various spiritual gifts, including discernment of spirits, were distributed throughout the community. Any Christian, empowered by the Holy Spirit and acting in the name of Jesus Christ, could potentially command demons to depart. This democratization of spiritual authority distinguished early Christianity from the professional priesthoods of pagan religion, and even from the specialized wonder workers of Jewish tradition. The power to banish evil was available to all who believed. Yet, even in the earliest period, the dangers of unauthorized exorcism were recognized. The book of Acts tells the cautionary tale of the 7 sons of Sceva, Jewish exorcists who attempted to use the name of Jesus without genuine faith. When they commanded an evil spirit to depart in the name of Jesus, whom Paul preaches, the demon responded that it knew Jesus and recognized Paul, but demanded to know who these presumptuous men were. The possessed man then attacked them with supernatural strength, and they fled, naked and wounded. This story warned that the name of Jesus was not a magical formula that worked automatically, but required genuine spiritual authority backed by authentic faith. As Christianity spread and institutionalized, exorcism became increasingly formalized. The office of exorcist emerged as one of the minor orders of clergy, a step on the path toward priesthood. Specific prayers and rituals developed for the expulsion of demons, drawing on scriptural texts and accumulated pastoral experience. The catechumενate, the period of preparation for baptism, included exorcisms that cleansed the converts of demonic influences accumulated during their pagan lives. Baptism itself was understood as a definitive break with the kingdom of darkness, a death to the old self enslaved to sin and demonic power. The renunciation of Satan and all his works formed a crucial element of the baptismal liturgy. The Church Fathers wrote extensively on demons and the methods of combating them. Origen of Alexandria developed sophisticated demonology that explained how fallen angels had become the demons that plagued humanity. Tertullian described how Christians routinely expelled demons that pagan priests could not touch, demonstrating the superior power of the true God. Augustine of Hippo, perhaps the most influential of the Western Fathers, provided theological frameworks for understanding demonic activity and the legitimacy of spiritual combat. These intellectual foundations gave Christian exorcism a doctrinal coherence that distinguished it from the more eclectic magical practices of the surrounding culture. The development of hagiography, the literature celebrating the lives of saints, provided models of heroic exorcism that inspired generations of believers. Saint Anthony of Egypt, the father of monasticism, famously battled demons in the desert, enduring their physical attacks and psychological torments through unwavering faith and ceaseless prayer. His biography, written by Athanasius, became one of the most widely read texts in the ancient church and established the archetype of the holy man whose sanctity gave him power over evil spirits. Other desert fathers and mothers developed practical techniques for spiritual combat that influenced monastic tradition for centuries. The medieval period witnessed both the elaboration of exorcism ritual and the intensification of demonological speculation. The church developed formal rites that combined scriptural readings, prayers, blessings with holy water, and direct commands to departing spirits. The sign of the cross, that gesture tracing the instrument of Christ's victory over death, became the primary apotropaic action in Christian practice. Demons were believed to flee before this sign, unable to endure the reminder of their defeat at Calvary. Cues, homes, persons, and objects were all signed with the cross to invoke divine protection. Holy water emerged as the quintessential Christian protective substance. Water, blessed by a priest and mixed with blessed salt, carried the power of divine benediction into material form. Sprinkling with holy water purified spaces, protected against demonic intrusion, and could even torment possessing spirits. The practice extended to blessing fields for good harvests, blessing animals for health, and blessing homes for protection. Every baptized Christian had access to this spiritual technology through their parish church, democratizing protective magic in a distinctively Christian form. Relics of saints, the physical remains of those who had achieved heroic sanctity, were believed to retain and radiate spiritual power. The bones, clothing, and objects associated with saints could heal the sick, protect the faithful, and drive away demons. Churches competed to acquire prestigious relics, and entire pilgrimage networks developed around shrines housing saintly remains. The theology underlying relic veneration held that the Holy Spirit, who had dwelt in the saint during life, continued to work through the physical remains after death. Demons could not endure proximity to such concentrated holiness and would flee from possessed persons brought near powerful relics. The ritual Romanum, finally codified in 1614, but drawing on centuries of accumulated practice, provided the official Catholic rite of exorcism that remained substantially unchanged until the 20th century. This text specified the prayers, readings, and commands to be used in formal exorcism, as well as the signs by which genuine possession could be distinguished from natural illness or fraud. The criteria included speaking or understanding languages unknown to the possessed person, knowledge of hidden or distant things, and the display of strength beyond natural capacity. The ritual itself was lengthy and demanding, potentially requiring multiple sessions over extended periods, as the exorcist engaged in direct spiritual combat with the possessing entity. The exorcist, operating under the ritual Romanum, did not rely on personal power, but on the authority of the Church and ultimately of Christ himself. The formula of exorcism commanded the demon in the name of God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, invoking the entire Trinity. Biblical texts describing divine victory over evil were read aloud. The demon was adjured by every sacred mystery of the faith, from the incarnation through the resurrection, to depart from the victim. Holy water was sprinkled, and the sign of the cross made repeatedly. The stole worn by the priest, a symbol of his ordained authority, might be placed around the neck of the possessed person, binding the demon with the power of the priesthood. Protestant reformers rejected much of medieval Catholic practice, but retained belief in demonic activity and the necessity of spiritual combat. Luther himself claimed numerous encounters with the devil and developed Protestant approaches to resisting demonic temptation. Reformed theology tended to understand possession as rarer than Catholic tradition acknowledged and emphasized prayer and faith over ritual formula. Yet Protestant pastors still engaged in what they termed deliverance ministry, praying with and for those believed to be under demonic influence. The theological framework shifted toward an understanding of spiritual warfare as primarily internal and moral. Though external demonic agency was not entirely denied, the modern period brought increasing skepticism about demonic possession among educated Christians. Medical and psychological explanations for conditions previously attributed to demons gained acceptance. In mainstream Protestant denominations, largely abandoned formal exorcism practice. Catholic Church retained its official rites, but employed them rarely, with strict protocols requiring medical and psychological evaluation before spiritual intervention. Yet the late 20th century witnessed renewed interest in spiritual warfare across Christian traditions. Charismatic and Pentecostal movements emphasized deliverance ministry. and even some mainline denominations reconsidered the reality of demonic influence. The official Catholic rite was revised in 1999, but retained its essential character. The theological framework underlying Christian exorcism remained remarkably consistent across centuries and confessions. Human beings, created good but fallen through sin, were vulnerable to demonic influence. The demons were understood as fallen angels, beings of great intelligence and power, who had rebelled against God and now sought to destroy humanity out of spite toward the Creator. Yet their power was strictly limited by divine sovereignty. They could only act within the boundaries God permitted, and their ultimate defeat was guaranteed by the victory Christ had won on the cross. The exorcist, therefore, operated with confidence, knowing that no demon could resist the authority of Christ properly invoked. The battle might be fierce, but the outcome was never in doubt. This understanding of cosmic spiritual warfare shaped Christian consciousness for 2 millennia. Every believer was a soldier in the ongoing conflict between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of darkness. The Church provided weapons for this battle in the sacraments, the scriptures, the prayers, and rituals that had proven effective against demonic assault: the sign of the cross, the invocation of holy names, the sprinkling of blessed water, the reading of sacred texts. All these tools equipped ordinary Christians to resist evil in their daily lives. The formal exorcism conducted by authorized clergy addressed extreme cases. But the practice of spiritual protection was woven into the fabric of everyday Christian existence. A constant reminder that the material world was not all that existed and that invisible forces contested for human souls. The revelation that descended upon Muhammad in the cave of Hira transformed not only the religious landscape of Arabia, but also humanity's understanding of the unseen world. Islam emerged with a comprehensive cosmology that acknowledged the existence of spiritual beings beyond human perception while maintaining strict monotheism. The Quran speaks clearly of jinn, beings created from smokeless fire who share the earth with humanity, yet remain largely invisible to ordinary sight. These entities possess free will and, like humans, they may choose righteousness or wickedness. Some have embraced Islam, while others persist in disbelief and malevolence. This sophisticated understanding of the spirit world gave rise to distinctive Islamic approaches to protection and banishing that remained vibrant today. The jinn occupy a unique position in Islamic thought, neither angels nor demons in the Christian sense, but a separate category of creation entirely. They live, marry, reproduce, and eventually die, though their lifespans far exceed those of humans. They eat and drink, though their sustenance differs from ours. They inhabit the spaces between human settlements, gathering in ruins, deserts, and places of impurity. Most significantly, they interact with humanity in ways that can be either beneficial or harmful. A righteous Muslim jinn might assist a pious human, while a malevolent one might torment, deceive, or even possess an unwary person. Understanding the nature of jinn is essential to understanding Islamic protective practices. Shaitan, the figure corresponding roughly to Satan in Christian tradition, is identified in Islamic sources as Iblis, a jinn of tremendous power who refused to bow before Adam when commanded by God. This act of prideful disobedience resulted in his expulsion from divine favor, though God granted him respite until the day of judgment. During this period, Iblis and his followers among the jinn worked to lead humanity astray, whispering temptations and fostering disbelief. Every human being faces this spiritual adversary, and the struggle against satanic influence constitutes a fundamental aspect of the Muslim religious life. Protection from Shaitan and his minions is therefore not a marginal concern, but a central preoccupation. The Quran itself provides the primary means of protection against malevolent spiritual forces. Muslims believe that the recitation of Quranic verses creates a shield against jinn and shayateen that no hostile entity can penetrate. Certain chapters and verses are considered particularly powerful for protective purposes. Ayat-al-Kursi, the throne verse from the second chapter, is perhaps the most frequently recited protective text. This magnificent passage describes the absolute sovereignty of God over all creation, his knowledge encompassing everything in the heavens and the earth. The person who recites this verse before sleep, according to prophetic tradition, will be guarded by an angel throughout the night, and no devil will approach until morning. The final 3 chapters of the Quran, known as the Mu'awwidatan and Al-Ikhlas, form a protective triad of immense importance. Surah Al-Ikhlas declares the absolute oneness and self-sufficiency of God. Surah Al-Fan seeks refuge in the Lord of the daybreak from the evils of creation, from the darkness when it settles, from those who blow on knots practicing sorcery, and from the envier when he envies. Surah An-Nas seeks refuge in the Lord of humanity, from the whisperer who withdraws, who whispers in the breasts of humanity, from among jinn and humans alike. The Prophet Muhammad himself recommended reciting these chapters 3 times each morning and evening for complete protection, and this practice remains standard among observant Muslims worldwide. Ruqya, the Islamic practice of spiritual healing and protection through Quranic recitation and prophetic supplications, represents the formalized approach to banishing harmful spiritual influences. A person suffering from what is believed to be jinn possession, the evil eye, or magical attack may seek ruqya from a knowledgeable practitioner. The treatment consists primarily of reciting Quran over the afflicted person, particularly the protective verses mentioned above, along with other passages known for their healing properties. The recitation may be accompanied by blowing gently over the patient, a practice the Prophet himself employed. Water, over which Quran has been recited, may be given to drink or used for bathing, carrying the blessing of the sacred words into the body. The legitimacy of ruqya rests entirely on its conformity to Islamic principles. The Prophet clearly permitted and practiced spiritual healing through Quranic recitation and approved supplications. However, he equally clearly prohibited practices that involved invoking beings other than God, using unintelligible words or formulas, or incorporating elements of pre-Islamic Arabian magic. This distinction between permissible ruqya and forbidden sorcery is crucial in Islamic thought. Ruqya works through the power of God's words and the supplication of his servants. Sorcery, by contrast, involves trafficking with jinn, a practice that constitutes shirk, the unforgivable sin of associating partners with God. The evil eye, known as Lain, is strongly affirmed in Islamic tradition as a genuine spiritual threat. The Prophet stated that the evil eye is real, and that if anything could overtake divine decree, it would be the evil eye. This envious gaze, whether intentional or not, can cause illness, misfortune, and even death. Protection against the evil eye begins with consciousness of God and regular recitation of protective formulas. When praising something or someone, Muslims are taught to say mashallah, acknowledging that the good comes from God's will, which deflects potential envy. The morning and evening supplications taught by the Prophet include specific protections against the evil eye, creating daily barriers against this omnipresent threat. The practice of reciting Bismillah in the name of God before undertaking any action serves as constant protection against spiritual harm. This phrase invokes divine blessing and creates a barrier that hostile entities cannot easily cross. Entering the home, eating, drinking, dressing, traveling. Indeed, virtually every significant action begins with this formula in traditional Muslim practice. The accumulated effect of this constant invocation is a life saturated with divine remembrance, leaving little room for malevolent interference. Similarly, the various supplications for different occasions taught by the Prophet constitute a comprehensive system of spiritual hygiene that maintains protective barriers throughout the day. Islamic scholars have debated extensively the nature and mechanisms of jinn possession. Speed. The majority view holds that jinn can indeed enter and inhabit human bodies, affecting thought, speech, and behavior. This possession may result from various causes. A person might inadvertently harm a jinn by pouring hot water in the place they inhabit, or otherwise disturbing them. A sorcerer might deliberately send a jinn to torment a victim. A jinn might become infatuated with a human and seek union through possession. Possession might occur as a test from God, afflicting even the righteous. Whatever the cause, the treatment remains essentially the same. Quranic recitation, applied with faith and persistence, will eventually drive out even the most stubborn possessing entity. The process of ruqya for possession cases can be demanding and prolonged. The practitioner recites Quran, particularly those verses that jinn find most difficult to endure. Ayat al-Kursi, the opening chapter al-Fatiha, and the protective chapters mentioned earlier form the core of this recitation. Verses describing hellfire and divine punishment may be employed to frighten the possessing jinn into departure. The practitioner may address the jinn directly, commanding it in the name of God to leave the victim and never return. Physical reactions, including violent movements, speaking in altered voices, and manifestations of superhuman strength are understood as signs that the recitation is affecting the possessing entity. The boundaries between permissible Islamic practice and forbidden magic are sometimes contested. Talismans and amulets present a particularly complex case. Some scholars permit wearing written Quranic verses for protection, viewing this as an extension of the protective power inherent in God's words. Others prohibit the practice, arguing that true protection comes from recitation and sincere faith, not from physical objects. The use of numbers, squares, and other geometric forms in purportedly Islamic talismans draws sharper condemnation, as these elements derive from magical traditions outside Islam and may invoke assistance from jinn. The conservative position holds that any practice not clearly established by the Prophet and his companions should be avoided, as innovation in religious matters leads to error. The relationship between Islamic protective practices and those of other traditions reveals both commonalities and distinctive features, like Jews and Christians. Muslims invoke divine names and sacred texts to repel evil. Like practitioners of earlier Near Eastern traditions, they recognize the power of certain substances and actions to create protected space. Yet, the Islamic emphasis on tawhid, the absolute oneness of God, shapes these practices in distinctive ways. There is no invoking of angels as independent powers, no commanding of spirits through magical authority. All protection comes from God alone, accessed through proper supplication and the recitation of his revealed words. The practitioner is not a magician wielding cosmic forces, but a humble servant calling upon the only true source of power. The spread of Islam across vast territories brought these protective practices into contact with diverse local traditions. In North Africa, the Levant, Persia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, Islamic approaches to the spirit world encountered and sometimes absorbed elements of indigenous belief. The jinn took on local characteristics, and practices of questionable Islamic authenticity sometimes gained popular acceptance. Reformist movements throughout Islamic history have periodically sought to purify these practices, returning to what they understood as authentic prophetic tradition. This tension between popular practice and scholarly reform continues today, as Muslims debate the boundaries of legitimate spiritual protection. Contemporary ruqya practice flourishes throughout the Muslim world and in Muslim communities globally. Some practitioners maintain traditional approaches, relying solely on Quranic recitation and prophetic supplications. Others have developed more elaborate methodologies, incorporating additional elements that claim basis in Islamic sources. The internet and social media have both spread these practices and sparked a debate about their legitimacy. Videos of ruqya sessions, sometimes showing dramatic manifestations of possession, circulate widely, bringing these traditionally private practices into public view. Medical and psychiatric perspectives add further complexity, as believers navigate between spiritual and clinical understandings of conditions that may involve both dimensions. The Islamic contribution to the history of banishing practices lies in its integration of protective magic into a comprehensive monotheistic framework, where other traditions might invoke multiple divine names, call upon various spiritual beings, or employ magical techniques of diverse origin. Islam insists that all protection comes from God alone and must be sought through means He has sanctioned. This purity of approach, this refusal to dilute divine sovereignty by appealing to lesser powers, gives Islamic protective practice its distinctive character. The Muslim-facing spiritual threat turns not to amulets of doubtful origin or incantations of unknown provenance, but to the words of the Quran and the supplications of the Prophet, confident that these divinely appointed means will provide whatever protection the divine wisdom deems necessary. The grimoire tradition represented a dangerous synthesis of Jewish mysticism, Greco-Roman magical practice, Christian demonology, and Arabic occult sciences. Its practitioners walked a razor's edge between damnation and power, seeking to command the very demons that Christian teaching warned would claim their souls. The origins of the European grimoire tradition reach back to late antiquity and the syncretistic magical culture of the Hellenistic world. Texts attributed to legendary figures like Solomon, Hermes, Trismegistus, and various biblical patriarchs circulated throughout the Mediterranean, promising mastery over spirits and access to hidden knowledge. As this material filtered into medieval Europe through Arabic translations and Byzantine manuscripts, it encountered a Christian culture deeply concerned with demons and their malevolent activities. The result was a distinctive form of ceremonial magic that employed Christian prayers, divine names, and angelic invocations alongside techniques derived from pagan and Jewish sources. The Key of Solomon, perhaps the most influential of all grimoires, claimed authorship by the biblical king, renowned for his wisdom and power over spirits. In reality, the text developed over centuries, with the oldest surviving manuscripts dating to the 14th and 15th centuries, though clearly drawing on much older material. The key provides comprehensive instructions for magical practice, including the creation of ritual implements, the timing of operations according to planetary hours, the construction of the magic circle, and the formulas for conjuring and dismissing spirits. Its influence on subsequent magical literature was immense, establishing templates that would be copied, adapted, and elaborated for centuries. The magic circle stands at the heart of grimoire practice, serving as the boundary between the magician and the dangerous forces he seeks to command. This circle was no mere line drawn on the floor, but a carefully constructed spiritual fortress, typically 9 feet in diameter, marked with divine names, angelic sigils, and protective symbols. Within this circle, the magician stood safe from the demons he summoned, protected by the sacred names inscribed around him. The circle represented a microcosm of divine order imposed upon chaos, a space where heavenly authority held absolute sway. No spirit, however powerful or malevolent, could cross this boundary to harm the operator who remained within. The construction of the circle required meticulous attention to detail. The grimoires specified exact materials, precise measurements, specific inscriptions that could not be altered without risking catastrophic failure. Divine names in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin ringed the circle's circumference. Crosses and pentacles marked the cardinal directions. The names of angels appropriate to the operation being performed were inscribed at designated points. Some traditions required the circle to be drawn with consecrated chalk or paint, others with the sword or knife that formed part of the magician's arsenal. The preparation might take hours, and any error could prove fatal when hostile spirits were finally called. Beyond the circle lay the triangle of art, the space where summoned spirits were constrained to appear. Its triangle, typically placed to the east of the circle, contained its own inscriptions and divine names that bound whatever entity manifested within it. The spirit could not leave the triangle without the magician's permission, could not lie while within its bounds according to some traditions, and was compelled to obey commands given from the safety of the circle. This arrangement established a clear hierarchy. The magician, operating under divine authority, commanded from his protected space, while the spirit, however unwillingly, was bound to comply. The ritual implements of the ceremonial magician carried specific consecrations and powers. The sword or knife, forged and inscribed according to precise instructions, served to threaten disobedient spirits and to draw the circle itself. The wand, typically made from specific woods, cut at astrologically appropriate times, directed the magician's will and channeled the forces he invoked. The pentacles, circular talismans inscribed with divine names and symbols, served various protective and compelling functions. Each instrument underwent elaborate consecration, often involving prayers, suffumigations with incense, and the recitation of psalms and divine names. Without this consecration, the tools were merely physical objects, powerless against spiritual entities. The Heptameron, attributed to Peter Diabano, provided detailed instructions for invoking the angels ruling each day of the week. This text exemplified the astrological foundations of grimoire magic, which understood celestial bodies as channels of spiritual influence and as rulers over particular classes of spirits. Operations performed on Sunday invoked the powers of the sun and its associated angels. Monday belonged to the moon, Tuesday to Mars, and so on through the planetary week. The timing of operations extended beyond days to specific hours, each governed by its own planetary ruler. A spirit of Venus might be summoned on Friday during a Venus hour for maximum efficacy. This temporal precision reflected the underlying assumption that the cosmos operated according to knowable laws that the skilled magician could exploit. The Gadia, forming the first part of the grimoire, known as the Lesser Key of Solomon, cataloged 72 demons with their names, ranks, appearances, and the services they could provide. Each demon was associated with a specific seal, a symbolic design that could be used to summon and control that particular entity. The demons ranged from kings and dukes to presidents and earls, organized in a hellish hierarchy that mirrored earthly aristocratic structures. Their offerings included knowledge of art and sciences, discovery of hidden treasures, influence over human minds, and various other benefits. Yet dealing with these beings was understood as extraordinarily dangerous, requiring exact adherence to ritual protocol and unwavering courage in the face of terrifying manifestations. The conjurations prescribed by the grimoires followed established patterns while varying in specific wording. The magician would begin by invoking divine authority, calling upon God by his many names and titles to compel the spirit's appearance. If the spirit failed to manifest, increasingly forceful conjurations would follow, threatening the entity with divine punishment for disobedience. The curses heaped upon recalcitrant spirits could be extraordinarily elaborate, condemning them to torments in the lowest depths of hell, hiding them with chains of divine fire, and threatening them with the wrath of angels. This escalating pressure continued until the spirit finally appeared within the triangle, ready to negotiate with the magician who had proved powerful enough to summon it. The dismissal of spirits was as crucial as their summoning. A spirit improperly dismissed might linger, causing harm to the magician or others in the vicinity. The license to depart granted the spirit permission to return to its place, usually with injunctions to go peacefully, to harm no one as it departed, and to return promptly when summoned again. The formal conclusion of the operation sealed the working, returning the cosmos to its normal state and releasing the tensions that the ritual had created. Neglecting this final stage was considered extremely dangerous, and the grimoires consistently emphasized the importance of proper dismissal. The practitioners of grimoire magic occupied an ambiguous position in medieval and Renaissance society. The Church officially condemned all traffic with demons as a mortal sin that imperiled the soul. Yet, the grimoires themselves employed Christian prayers, divine names, and religious symbolism throughout their operations. Many practitioners understood themselves as working within a Christian framework, using divine authority to command spirits for beneficial purposes. Some were clergy, their knowledge of Latin and access to manuscripts making them likely candidates for magical practice. Others were nobles or educated commoners seeking power, wealth, or knowledge through supernatural means. All risked persecution if their activities came to the attention of ecclesiastical or civil authorities. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in ancient wisdom, and with it, an explosion of magical literature. Scholars like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola developed sophisticated philosophical frameworks that legitimized certain forms of magic as natural or celestial, distinguishing these from the demonic magic that remained condemned. Cornelius Agrippa's Monumental. 3 books of occult philosophy synthesized magical traditions from across the ancient and medieval world, providing theoretical foundations for practical operations. John Dee, advisor to Queen Elizabeth of England, developed his own system of angelic magic through communications he believed came from heavenly beings. These learned magicians elevated the art beyond the crude demon conjuring of earlier grimoires toward more spiritual and philosophical goals. If the grimoire tradition persisted alongside these more refined approaches, texts like the Grand Grimoire and the Grimoire of Pope Honorius continued to circulate, promising direct access to demonic powers for those willing to risk the dangers involved. These later grimoires often showed less concern for spiritual safety and more interest in practical results, reflecting a democratization of magic as literacy spread and printed books became available. The elaborate precautions of earlier texts might be abbreviated or omitted, increasing the dangers, but also lowering the barriers to entry. Anyone with access to a grimoire and the nerve to attempt its operations might seek to command spirits, regardless of their learning or spiritual preparation. The technology of banishing embedded in the grimoire tradition drew on all the sources that had fed into this syncretic system. The divine names came primarily from Jewish mysticism, though Greek and Latin sacred words also appeared. The protective circle echoed Mesopotamian and Greco-Roman practices while incorporating distinctively Christian elements. The commanding of spirits through threat and compulsion reflected ancient Near Eastern precedents, while the elaborate ceremonial procedures showed the influence of temple ritual traditions. Everything was unified under a Christian cosmological framework that positioned the magician as an agent of divine authority, temporarily granted power over beings that would otherwise be his spiritual superiors. The dismissal formulas of the grimoires established templates that would influence later magical traditions, including those that explicitly rejected the demonic focus of the old books. The basic pattern of invoking authority, establishing boundaries, commanding spirits, and formally concluding the operation would persist through the transformations of magical practice in the 19th and 20th centuries. When later magicians developed new rituals for new purposes, they drew on the structural logic of the grimoire tradition, even when they rejected its specific content. The medieval and Renaissance ceremonial magicians, laboring in candlelit chambers over manuscripts of dubious provenance, created a technology of spiritual operation that proved remarkably durable, adapting to each new era while maintaining its essential character as humanity's most elaborate attempt to command the spirits that haunted the shadows of the world. The fog-shrouded streets of Victorian London witnessed many strange gatherings behind closed doors, but few would prove as influential as the meetings of a small group of occultists who called themselves the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Founded in 1888, this magical society would transform Western esotericism, systematizing centuries of accumulated magical lore into a coherent curriculum and creating ritual forms that continue to dominate occult practice today. Among their many contributions, none has proven more enduring or more widely adopted than the Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram, a ceremony so elegant and effective that it has become virtually synonymous with modern magical practice itself. The Golden Dawn emerged from the fertile soil of Victorian occultism, a world populated by spiritualists, theosophists, Rosicrucian enthusiasts, and students of ancient mysteries. Its three founders brought different strengths to the enterprise. William Robert Woodman was a scholarly Freemason with deep knowledge of Kabbalistic traditions. William Wynne Westcott, a London coroner, possessed extensive familiarity with Hermetic texts and claimed possession of mysterious cipher manuscripts that provided the basis for the order's rituals. Samuel Little MacGregor Mathers, the most flamboyant of the three, was a brilliant ritualist and translator who would shape the order's magical practices more than any other individual. Together, they created an initiatory system that synthesized Kabbalah, tarot, astrology, geomancy, alchemy, and ceremonial magic into a unified whole. The cipher manuscripts that Westcott claimed to have discovered, or perhaps created, outlined a system of great initiations corresponding to the Sephiroth of the Kabbalistic tree of life. Each grade involves specific rituals, knowledge lectures, and practical exercises that progressively developed the initiate's magical abilities. The outer order grades, from neophyte through philosophus, provided foundational training in magical theory and basic practices. The inner order, accessible only to those who had proven their dedication and capability, taught advanced ceremonial magic, including the evocation of spirits and the creation of talismans. This structured approach to magical education was revolutionary, replacing the haphazard transmission of grimoire knowledge with a systematic curriculum. The Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram, often abbreviated as LBRP, was among the first practices taught to new initiates. Its purpose was straightforward, yet profound. The ritual cleared the magical space of unwanted influences, established a protected zone for further work, and attuned the practitioner to the divine forces that would empower more advanced operations. Unlike the elaborate preparations required by medieval grimoires, the LBRP could be performed anywhere, at any time, with no implements beyond the practitioner's own body and voice. Its accessibility democratized banishing practice, making effective spiritual protection available to anyone willing to learn the simple yet potent ceremony. The ritual begins with what is called the Kabbalistic cross, gesture that establishes the practitioner as a living embodiment of the tree of life. Standing facing east, the magician touches the forehead while vibrating the Hebrew word Eta, meaning thou. The hand then descends to the chest or solar plexus while vibrating Malkuth, meaning the kingdom. The right shoulder is touched while vibrating Vagabora, meaning and the power. Then the left shoulder while vibrating Vagula, meaning and the glory. The hands are then clasped at the chest while vibrating Lawalam. Amen, meaning forever. Amen. This sequence traces a cross upon the body while affirming divine sovereignty, aligning the magician with cosmic forces before any other work begins. The use of Hebrew in this opening gesture reflects the Kabbalistic foundations of Golden Dawn magic. The words are not merely translated from the Christian doxology, but carry specific vibrational qualities that the original language was believed to possess. Hebrew was understood as a sacred tongue, its letters and words inherently connected to the spiritual realities they represented. By speaking in Hebrew, the magician was not merely describing divine attributes, but actually invoking them, drawing down the powers of the Sephiroth into the physical body. The Kabbalistic cross transformed the practitioner into a living talisman, a conduit for divine energy properly aligned with cosmic structure. Following the Kabbalistic cross, the practitioner traces pentagrams at the 4 cardinal directions, beginning in the east. The pentagram itself is a symbol of profound antiquity, but in Golden Dawn usage, it acquired specific meanings and applications. The 5-pointed star represented the 4 classical elements surmounted by spirit, the divine quintessence that unified and transcended the elemental world. The banishing pentagram of earth, used in the LBRP, was traced in a particular manner, starting from the lower left point and moving to the apex, then continuing around the figure. Its direction of tracing was believed to send earthly and material energies away from the magician, clearing the space of accumulated spiritual debris. As each pentagram is traced, the magician vibrates a divine name appropriate to that quarter. In the East, the name is YHVH, the Tetragrammaton, the unpronounceable name of God, spelled with the Hebrew letters Yod, He, Vav, He. In the South, the name is Adonai, meaning Lord. In the West, Ehi, meaning I am, the name God spoke to Moses from the burning bush. In the North, AGLA, a notarican or acronym for the Hebrew phrase, meaning Thou art mighty forever, O Lord. These four names invoke different aspects of divine power, each appropriate to the elemental attribution of its quarter. The East corresponds to air, the South to fire, the West to water, and the North to earth in the Golden Dawn system. Between each pentagram, the magician traces a line of white light, connecting the figures into a continuous circle of protection. This circumambulation echoes ancient protective practices while incorporating the symbolism of the endless circle, a boundary without beginning or end that hostile forces cannot cross. The completed circle of pentagrams establishes a fortress of divine names and sacred geometry, transforming ordinary space into consecrated ground. Within this boundary, the magician stands safe from spiritual interference, prepared for whatever work may follow. The ritual continues with the invocation of the four great archangels, calling upon these mighty beings to stand guard at the cardinal points. Facing east once more, the magician declares that before him stands Raphael, the archangel of air and healing, visualized as a tall figure robed in yellow with violet highlights, carrying the caduceus and associated with the morning breeze. Behind, in the west, stands Gabriel, archangel of water and messenger of divine mysteries, visualized in blue and orange, bearing a chalice and associated with the vast ocean. At the right hand, in the south, stands Michael, archangel of fire and protector against evil, visualized in red and green, bearing a flaming sword and radiating fierce heat. At the left hand, in the north, stands Uriel, archangel of earth and illumination, visualized in citrine, olive, russet, and black, the colors of earth, bearing sheaves of wheat and emanating stability. The invocation of these four archangels draws on Jewish and Christian angelology while adapting it to the specific structure of Golden Dawn practice. Each archangel corresponds not only to a direction and element, but to a host of other attributions, including tarot suits, Kabbalistic worlds, and magical weapons. The visualization of the archangels as towering figures surrounding the magician creates a profound sense of protection. A company of divine guardians whose presence banishes any hostile entity. The practitioner stands at the center of a cosmic arrangement, the intersection of elemental forces balanced and protected by celestial beings of immense power. The ritual concludes with a second performance of the Kabbalistic cross, sealing the working and affirming once more the magician's alignment with divine structure. The entire ceremony takes only a few minutes to perform, yet accomplishes what medieval ceremonial magic required hours of preparation to achieve. This efficiency was deliberate. Mathers and the other Golden Dawn founders understood that effective magical practice required regular application, and a ritual that demanded extensive setup would rarely be performed. The LBRP was designed for daily use, a spiritual hygiene practice as fundamental to the magician as physical washing was to bodily health. The effects attributed to regular practice of the LBRP are extensive. Practitioners report increased clarity of mind, reduction of negative influences in their lives, enhanced sensitivity to spiritual presences, and a general sense of being centered and protected. The ritual serves as both a banishing and an invocation, clearing away unwanted influences while simultaneously invoking divine protection. Some practitioners perform it twice daily, upon waking and before sleep, creating a rhythm of purification that structures their entire lives around magical practice. Others employ it before any spiritual working, ensuring that the space is clear and protected before more specialized operations begin. The Golden Dawn's influence extended far beyond its formal membership, which probably never exceeded a few hundred individuals. Its teachings spread through schisms and successor organizations, through published accounts, and eventually through full disclosure of its rituals and knowledge lectures. Aleister Crowley, perhaps the most famous and infamous of all Golden Dawn initiates, published much of the order's material, making previously secret teachings widely available. Dion Fortune, Israel Regardie, and other former members contributed their own accounts and elaborations. By the mid-20th century, the Golden Dawn system had become the common inheritance of Western occultism, its vocabulary, symbols, and practices defining what magic meant in the English-speaking world. The Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram specifically achieved a universality that its creators could hardly have imagined. It was adopted by Thelemites following Crowley's teachings, by Wiccans developing their own forms of circle casting, by chaos magicians who stripped it to its essential elements, and by countless solitary practitioners who encountered it through books and later through the internet. Each tradition adapted the ritual to its own purposes while maintaining its essential structure. Some changed the divine names, others modified the visualizations, but the basic pattern of cross, pentagrams, and angelic invocation proved remarkably robust, functioning effectively across a wide range of magical frameworks. The genius of the LBRP lies in its synthesis of simplicity and depth. On the surface, it is a straightforward ritual that can be learned in an afternoon and performed in minutes. Yet, beneath this simplicity lies a structure of profound sophistication, drawing on Kabbalistic theory, angelology, elemental philosophy, and sacred geometry. Each element of the ritual connects two vast networks of correspondence and meaning that the dedicated student can explore for a lifetime. The pentagram alone opens doorways to considerations of the elements, the planets, the human body, and the relationship between matter and spirit. The divine names invite study of Hebrew letter, mysticism, and the theology of sacred naming. The archangels connect 2 centuries of devotional and magical practice surrounding these celestial beings. The Golden Dawn created something unprecedented in the history of Western magic by systematizing the accumulated lore of centuries into a coherent curriculum and by developing rituals that distilled this knowledge into practical form. They made ceremonial magic accessible to ordinary, educated individuals in a way it had never been before. The Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram stands as their most successful creation, a ritual so effective and so adaptable that it has become the foundation upon which virtually all subsequent Western magical practice has been built. When modern practitioners cleared their space before meditation, established protected circles before ritual, or invoked divine names and angelic presences, they almost invariably employed techniques that can be traced directly to those fog-bound London meetings where Mathers, Westcott, and Woodman first forged the tools that would reshape the magical world. The Golden Dawn did not survive intact into the 20th century. Internal disputes, personality conflicts, and the inevitable fragmentation that afflicts esoteric organizations tore the order apart within 2 decades of its founding. Yet, from its dissolution emerged figures who would carry its magical technologies forward, adapting and transforming them for new spiritual visions. None proved more influential, more controversial, or more enduring in his impact than Aleister Crowley, the man who would take the Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram and reshape it according to his own revolutionary magical philosophy. Crowley entered the Golden Dawn in 1898, a young man of considerable intelligence, inherited wealth, and boundless ambition. He quickly mastered the order's curriculum, displaying genuine aptitude for the ceremonial arts, even as his abrasive personality alienated fellow members. The schisms that fractured the Golden Dawn found Crowley at the center of controversy, and by the early years of the new century, he had departed to forge his own magical path. That path would lead him to Cairo in 1904, where he received what he claimed was a communication from a pre-human intelligence that would reshape the trajectory of Western occultism. The Book of the Law, dictated over 3 days by an entity Crowley called Aios, proclaimed the dawning of a new spiritual epoch. The Aeon of Osiris, characterized by self-sacrifice and the worship of dying gods, had ended. In its place arose the Aeon of Horus, the crowned and conquering child, proclaiming as its central axiom the phrase that would become Crowley's watchword: "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." This was not, as critics often assumed, a license for hedonistic indulgence, but rather a command to discover and execute one's true will, the authentic purpose for which each soul incarnated. This new philosophical framework, which Crowley termed thelema from the Greek word for will, demanded new ritual forms. The ceremonies of the Golden Dawn, steeped in Christian and Jewish symbolism, could not adequately express the principles of the new Aeon. Crowley set about creating a complete magical system that reflected the Lemmic cosmology, and among his most significant creations was the ritual he called the Star Ruby, a banishing ceremony designed to replace the Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram for practitioners of the new dispensation. The Star Ruby retained the basic structure of the LBRP while transforming every element into the Limbic idiom, where the older ritual began with the Kabbalistic cross. Invoking Hebrew divine names and establishing the magician upon the tree of life, the Star Ruby opened with different gestures and Greek phrases. The practitioner touched forehead, genitals, right shoulder, and left shoulder while vibrating words that affirmed the principles of thelema, psi, meaning thine, acknowledged the divine. Ophal, meaning Ophalis, affirmed the creative principle. Iskaros, meaning mighty, declared strength. Eucharistos, meaning blessed, proclaimed sanctification. Ao closed the gesture, the 3 letters representing Isis, Apophis, and Osiris. The formula of death and resurrection, central to the Lemmic initiation. The pentagrams traced at the quarters were no longer the earth pentagrams of the Golden Dawn system, but hexagrams containing pentagrams, more complex figures that encoded different spiritual principles. The divine names at the quarters changed from the Hebrew names of the older ritual to Greek words representing the 4 elements in their thelemic interpretation. Therian in the east, Noi in the north, Babylon in the west, Kaded in the south replaced Yahweh, Adonai, Ihi, and Agla. These names derive from the Book of the Law and its symbolic system, connecting the practitioner to the egregore of Thelema rather than the Judeo-Christian current. The angelic figures of the LBRP underwent similar transformation, where Raphael, Gabriel, Michael, and Uriel stood at the quarters in the Golden Dawn ritual. The Star Ruby invoked figures from Crowley's received texts and magical experiences. The ritual called upon the spirits of Set, Bebros, Thermoth, Sanatron, beings associated with the Limbic cosmology in Crowley's personal magical work. This substitution was not arbitrary, but reflected Crowley's belief that each Aeon required its own spiritual vocabulary, its own divine names attuned to the specific vibrational qualities of the age. Crowley's innovations extended beyond mere substitution of names and symbols. He introduced into the Star Ruby and other rituals physical movements and postures that engaged the body more dynamically than the relatively static Golden Dawn ceremonies. The practitioner was instructed to stamp and spin, to make specific signs and gestures, to employ the physical form as an instrument of magical expression. This emphasis on movement reflected Crowley's understanding of magic as a total engagement of being, not merely an intellectual or verbal exercise, but a full-bodied participation in cosmic forces. The Star Ruby never achieved the universal adoption of the LBRP, remaining primarily the province of Thelemites and those specifically working within Crowley's system. Yet its influence proved significant, demonstrating that the underlying structure of banishing ritual could be adapted to different theological frameworks while retaining its efficacy. Crowley showed that what made banishing work was not the specific names invoked or symbols traced, but the structure of the operation itself, the establishment of protected space, the alignment with transpersonal forces, and the assertion of the magician's authority over the spiritual environment. This insight would prove crucial for later developments in Western magic, particularly the emergence in the late 20th century of the approach known as chaos magic, where traditional ceremonial magic assumed the objective reality of the spirits, forces, and structures it employed. Chaos magic proposed a radically different understanding. The entities and energies of magical practice were not external realities to be contacted, but psychological constructs to be employed, useful fictions whose power derived from the practitioner's belief rather than from ontological existence. Chaos magic current emerged primarily in England during the 1970s and 1980s, its most influential early proponents being Peter Carroll and Ray Sherwin, drawing on sources as diverse as Austin Osman Spare's sigil magic, quantum physics, psychology, and science fiction. Chaos magicians proposed that belief itself was the tool to be adopted and discarded according to practical necessity. A chaos magician might work with Egyptian deities one week, Norse gods the next, and fictional entities from Lovecraft or comic books thereafter, shifting paradigms as one might change clothes. This paradigm-shifting approach had profound implications for banishing practice. If the entities being banished were psychological constructs, then banishing itself became a psychological technique rather than a spiritual operation. The chaos magic understanding of banishing emphasized its effects on consciousness rather than on objective spiritual reality. A banishing ritual cleared the mind, established boundaries in awareness, and created optimal conditions for magical work by disciplining attention and intention. Whether it also affected actual spirits became a question chaos magicians considered irrelevant or unanswerable. Carroll's Liber No, published in 1978, included a banishing ritual called the Gnostic Pentagram ritual that exemplified the chaos approach. Like the LBRP and the Star Ruby before it, it maintained the basic structure of establishing space through gestures, words, and traced symbols. But the names employed were deliberately non-traditional, vibrated vowel sounds rather than divine names from any particular tradition. This made the ritual usable by practitioners of any belief system or none, removing the necessity of engaging with Jewish, Christian, or Thelemic egregores. The Gnostic Pentagram ritual replaced the Kabbalistic cross with what Carroll called the cross of chaos. The practitioner touched forehead while intoning I, solar plexus while intoning E, genitals while intoning A, left shoulder while intoning O, and right shoulder while intoning E. These vowels corresponded to the points of the chaosphere. Chaosphere, the 8-pointed star that served as the primary symbol of chaos magic. The pentagrams, traced at the quarters, were accompanied by the vibration of these same vowels, each direction receiving a different sound. The effect was a banishing that drew on no specific tradition, invoking no named entities, pure technique, stripped of theological content. This minimalist approach influenced practitioners far beyond the chaos magic community. The insight that banishing could work through attention, intention, and structured action without requiring commitment to any particular belief system made such practices accessible to skeptics, gnostics, and eclectic seekers who might have been reluctant to engage with traditional ceremonial magic. The psychological model of magic, emphasizing the effects of ritual on the practitioner's mind rather than on external spirits, provided a framework that even materialistically inclined individuals could accept and employ. Meanwhile, quite different approaches to banishing were developing within the neo-pagan communities that flourished in the latter half of the 20th century. Wicca, the witchcraft religion that emerged publicly in England in the 1950s through the work of Gerald Gardner, incorporated circle casting as a central ritual element. The Wiccan circle functioned similarly to the ceremonial magician's banished space, creating a protected zone between the worlds where magical operations could safely occur. Yet the style and symbolism differed markedly from the ceremonial tradition, with the Golden Dawn and its derivatives employed complex Hebrew names, angelic invocations, and elaborate symbolism drawn from Kabbalah and Hermeticism. Wiccan circle casting typically invoked elemental powers through simpler means. The high priestess or practitioner walked the perimeter of the ritual space, often with an anthem or ritual knife extended, visualizing energy flowing to form a sphere of protection. The quarters were saluted and their guardians invited, but these guardians were often conceived as elemental spirits, watchtowers, or animal totems, rather than the named archangels of ceremonial magic. This accessibility reflected Wicca's roots in folk magic and its orientation toward practitioners who might lack the training and resources for elaborate ceremonial work. A Wiccan circle could be cast in a living room, a backyard, or a forest clearing with minimal equipment and no extensive study of Hebrew or Latin. This democratization of magical practice extended the reach of banishing and protection techniques to audiences far larger than ceremonial magic had ever touched, even as it sometimes sacrificed the precision and power that more elaborate systems could generate. The neo-pagan movement spawned numerous variations and offshoots, each developing its own approaches to establishing sacred space and banishing unwanted influences. Druids, heathens, practitioners of various reconstructed ancient traditions, and eclectic practitioners, drawing from multiple sources, all evolved techniques suited to their specific cosmologies and ritual needs. Some hewed close to historical sources, attempting to reconstruct the protective practices of pre-Christian cultures. Others freely innovated, combining elements from disparate traditions according to personal intuition and practical results. This proliferation of approaches might seem to dissolve the concept of banishing into meaningless multiplicity, with so many different techniques claiming similar results, yet certain common elements persisted across all these variations. The establishment of defined space remained central, whether through traced pentagrams, walked circles, or other means of demarcation. The invocation of protective powers, whether named angels, abstract forces, elemental spirits, or psychological constructs, consistently appeared. The assertion of the practitioner's authority over the ritual environment, the right and power to exclude unwanted influences, unified practices otherwise quite different in outer form. These commonalities suggested that beneath the surface diversity of symbol and style lay functional principles that transcended any particular tradition. The human being standing in the center of created sacred space, aligned with transpersonal powers, asserting sovereignty over spiritual environment. This was the essential pattern repeated in countless variations across cultures and centuries. The specific names spoken, the exact symbols traced, particular entities invoked. These were local expressions of a universal template, quote, clothing that could change while the underlying structure remained constant. The late 20th and early 21st centuries saw continued evolution in banishing practice. The internet enabled unprecedented sharing of magical techniques across geographical and traditional boundaries. Practitioners could compare the LBRP with Wiccan circle casting, study chaos magic alongside traditional thelema, tained, examine reconstructed historical practices from Mesopotamia to medieval Europe. This access to diverse traditions facilitated experimentation and synthesis, with many contemporary practitioners developing personalized banishing rituals that drew elements from multiple sources. Some voiced concern that this eclecticism diluted the power of traditional forms, that the efficacy of banishing depended on connection to established egregores and initiatory lineages that eclectic practice could not provide. Others argued that the proliferation of approaches demonstrated the resilience and adaptability of magical technology, its capacity to serve human needs across changing cultural contexts. Both perspectives contained truth, and the tension between tradition and innovation continue to energize contemporary magical discourse, ensuring that the art of banishing would continue evolving for generations to come. The question that has haunted the practice of banishing from its earliest Mesopotamian origins to its contemporary chaos magic variations remains unanswered by any means that would satisfy a skeptical mind. Do these rituals actually affect an objective spiritual reality, clearing spaces of genuine entities and forces that exist independent of human belief? Or do they work entirely within the theater of consciousness, their power derived from psychological mechanisms that require no supernatural explanation? The history we have traced offers evidence for both interpretations, and perhaps the most honest conclusion is that we do not and cannot know with certainty which understanding is correct. What we can examine with some rigor is the psychological dimension of banishing practice, the effects these rituals demonstrably produce in the minds and lives of those who perform them. Here the work of Carl Gustav Jung provides an invaluable framework, not because Jung validated magical practice, but because his psychological theories illuminate why such practices might prove meaningful and effective regardless of their metaphysical status. Jung's concept of the shadow, in particular, offers insight into what banishing rituals accomplish on the level of the psyche. The shadow, in Jungian thought, represents those aspects of the self that consciousness has rejected, denied, or failed to recognize. These disowned elements do not disappear when ignored, but rather accumulate in the unconscious, where they gain power through repression. The shadow contains not only personal failings and unacceptable impulses, but also unlived potentials and rejected strengths. When unacknowledged, shadow material tends to project outward, appearing to belong to others or to external forces rather than to oneself. The demons that haunt human imagination, from the Mesopotamian Udag to the Christian devil, might be understood as cultural projections of collective shadow material, figures onto which societies have displaced their unintegrated darkness. Viewed through this lens, banishing rituals serve a vital psychological function. They provide structured encounters with shadow material, opportunities to acknowledge and address what has been denied. The magician, standing in the center of traced pentagrams, commanding spirits to depart, engages in a symbolic drama that parallels the therapeutic process of recognizing and integrating shadow content. The ritual does not destroy the shadow, which would be neither possible nor desirable, but establishes proper relationship with it. Boundaries that neither deny its existence nor allow it to overwhelm consciousness. The establishment of sacred space through banishing can be understood as the creation of a temenos, Jung's term for the protected psychological container within which transformative work becomes possible. Just as the therapeutic relationship provides a bounded space where difficult material can safely emerge, the banished circle provides a psychological environment where the practitioner can engage with transpersonal forces without being overwhelmed. The ritual boundary is simultaneously a protection and a permission, keeping out what would disrupt while inviting in what serves growth and integration. This psychological interpretation does not require denying the possible reality of spirits or subtle forces. Jung himself remained carefully agnostic on metaphysical questions, acknowledging that the archetypes and autonomous complexes he described in psychological terms might equally be understood as spiritual entities. What mattered for therapeutic purposes was not their ultimate nature, but their functional reality, their capacity to affect human consciousness and behavior. A spirit that exists only psychologically can still profoundly impact a life, and a ritual that works only through psychological mechanisms can still produce genuine transformation. Modern neuroscience offers additional perspectives on why ritual practices like banishing might prove effective. Research into meditation and other contemplative practices has demonstrated measurable effects on brain structure and function, with regular practice associated with changes in regions governing attention, emotion, regulation, and stress response. While banishing rituals have not been specifically studied with the same rigor, They share many characteristics with practices that have shown neurological effects: the focused attention, rhythmic breathing, physical gestures, and vocalization involved in ceremonial banishing engage multiple brain systems simultaneously, potentially producing states of consciousness quite different from ordinary waking awareness. The placebo effect, often invoked dismissively to explain ritual efficacy, actually reveals something profound about the relationship between belief and bodily reality. Placebos can produce measurable physiological changes. It's not merely subjective feelings of improvement, but objective alterations in biological functioning. If belief can affect physical health, it seems reasonable that it might also affect psychological states and, through them, life circumstances. The elaborate structure of banishing rituals, with their invocations, symbols, and gestures, might function partly as sophisticated placebos, mobilizing the mind's capacity to shape experience through the power of expectation and conviction. Environmental psychology offers yet another angle of understanding. Human beings respond powerfully to their physical and social environments, with space affecting mood, cognition, and behavior in well-documented ways. The act of ritually defining and purifying a space transforms the practitioner's relationship to that space, regardless of whether any objective spiritual change occurs. A room that has been ceremonially banished feels different to the person who performed the ritual, and that felt difference can influence everything that subsequently happens in that space. The ritual creates meaning where there was none, or rather, it makes explicit and deliberate the meaning-making that humans constantly perform unconsciously. The future of banishing practice likely lies in this integration of perspectives, combining the wisdom of traditional forms with insights from psychology, neuroscience, and related fields. Already, we see practitioners approaching magic with greater psychological sophistication, understanding their rituals as working on multiple levels simultaneously. The spirits they address may be autonomous complexes, archetypal forces, aspects of collective unconscious, or genuinely independent entities, perhaps all of these at once. The sophisticated practitioner need not choose a single interpretation, but can hold multiple frameworks in creative tension. Technology presents both opportunities and challenges for the continuation of banishing traditions. On one hand, the internet has made magical knowledge more accessible than ever before, allowing seekers to study diverse traditions and connect with teachers across geographical boundaries. Texts that once circulated only among initiates can now be downloaded in moments. Instructional videos demonstrate techniques that previously required in-person transmission. Systematicization of esoteric knowledge extends the reach of banishing practice to audiences that traditional transmission methods could never have touched. On the other hand, the digital environment itself presents novel challenges for spiritual hygiene. The constant connectivity of contemporary life, the endless streams of information and stimulation, the algorithmically curated content designed to capture and hold attention. These create conditions that traditional banishing rituals were never designed to address. Some practitioners have begun adapting classical techniques for digital contexts, performing rituals before and after internet use, developing practices specifically aimed at clearing the psychic residue of online engagement. Whether these adaptations will prove effective remains to be seen, but the impulse behind them reflects the enduring human need that banishing has always served. The psychological pressures of modern existence may actually increase the relevance of banishing practice rather than diminishing it. Anxiety disorders affect unprecedented portions of the population. Depression has reached epidemic proportions. A pervasive sense of being overwhelmed, invaded, unable to maintain boundaries, characterizes much contemporary experience. These conditions, whatever their neurological and social causes, mirrored the states that traditional peoples attributed to spiritual interference. The Aipu priest banishing demons from an afflicted Babylonian might recognize something familiar. In the modern person seeking protection from the relentless intrusions of a hyperconnected world, what banishing offers across all its traditional and contemporary forms is the assertion of sovereignty over one's immediate environment and inner life. The practitioner who stands in the center of traced pentagrams and commands unwanted influences to depart and acts a profound affirmation. This space is mine. I have the right and the power to determine what enters here. In a world where boundaries are constantly violated, where attention is harvested and sold, where the autonomous self seems increasingly like an illusion, this assertion carries weight beyond its magical intention. The ritual becomes a practice of selfhood, a regular reminder that one possesses the authority to establish limits and maintain them. The future will undoubtedly bring new forms of banishing, adapted to conditions we cannot yet imagine. But if history teaches anything, it is that the fundamental human need these practices address will persist. We are beings who live at thresholds, suspended between matter and spirit, self and other, order and chaos. We require techniques for managing these boundaries, for establishing protected spaces within which we can live and work and grow. Whether we understand these techniques in spiritual, psychological, or neurological terms matters less than that we have them, that we practice them, that we pass them on. From the Ipu priest holding a torch in ancient Babylon to the Golden Dawn magician tracing pentagrams in Victorian London, from the chaos magician vibrating vows in a council flat to the solitary practitioner casting a circle by candlelight in a suburban bedroom, the lineage of banishing stretches unbroken. Each generation receives the tradition, adapts it to contemporary understanding and need, and transmits it forward. The specific forms change, the theological frameworks shift, the explanatory models evolve, but the essential act remains. A human being establishes sacred space, invokes protective powers, and asserts authority over the threshold between worlds. This is among the oldest of human technologies, as ancient as language itself, perhaps older. Before we had words for what we did, we likely made protective gestures, uttered sounds of power, traced symbols in ash or blood or earth. The impulse runs deeper than culture, deeper than history, into the bedrock of what it means to be conscious in a universe that seems vastly larger than ourselves. We cannot know whether our rituals touch objective spiritual reality, cannot know whether the forces we address possess independent existence. But we can know that the practices work, that they produce effects in consciousness and life, that they serve needs that apparently nothing else can serve as well. The journey from Mesopotamia to the present day reveals not a primitive superstition, gradually overcome by reason, but an evolving technology continually refined to meet changing conditions. The demons named by Babylonian priests differ from the psychological complexes described by Jungian analysts. Apiece, both frameworks address real phenomena that require real responses. The incantations of the Maqlû differ from the Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram, but both employ similar mechanisms to achieve similar ends. Understanding develops, methods improve, but the fundamental human situation remains. We dwell at the threshold, and we need ways to guard it. As you drift toward sleep, perhaps the ancient words still echo. Perhaps the traced symbols still glow in imagination. The circle has been cast around you. The quarters have been sealed. The guardians have been called. Whatever darkness prowls beyond the boundary, whatever thoughts or fears or nameless disturbances might otherwise intrude, they are held at bay for now. You rest in protected space, in the sacred temanos that humans have created and inhabited since before recorded time. The art of banishing has carried you here through millennia of accumulated wisdom, to this moment of peace at the threshold of dreams. The spirits have been commanded, the space has been cleared, and the silence that remains is filled only with the gentle presence of whatever benevolent powers watch over sleeping souls.